Well, good morning. I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks to the George Marshall Institute and TechAmerica for the opportunity to be here today. Oh, I'm assuming it's on.
It's not. It's for
Oh, it's not.
recording.
Oh, okay. All right. I was asked to talk about the role of China's ASAT and missile defense capabilities in Chinese security policy. It is no accident, I would suggest, that both of these topics relate to aspects of both our conception and the Chinese one of deterrence. So in order to set the stage for our discussion this morning, I'd like to explore a little bit about how these two aspects are in fact different. Now, in considering Beijing's views of security and in particular of deterrence, I think it's very important to keep in mind three considerations. First is that China, unlike the West, does not have much in the way of experience in bolt out of the blue operations. There is nothing quite comparable to Pearl Harbor or Operation Barbarossa in the Chinese security concept. At the same time, the PLA and Chinese leadership in general doesn't seem to exhibit nearly the same degree of concern with inadvertent war. The lessons from World War I, as we come up on the first 100th anniversary of World War I, for the West was that wars, crises, gain their own momentum. And therefore, it is essential to recognize the possibility of both that momentum and also of miscalculation. China's experience with wars is very different. There is no Cuban Missile Crisis per se. World War I was very different. And so China's experience with conflict has been one of deliberate invasion, whether by the Chinese themselves, as the PLA did in India in 1962 or Vietnam in 1979, or the Soviet Union in 1969, or being invaded, such as by the Japanese. That's a very different context then for thinking about crises and thinking about deterrence and thinking about escalation. And third, the PRC view of deterrence for most of its history has not in fact been bilateral. One of the interesting things that I'll get into briefly is how much of our literature of especially nuclear deterrence is rooted in the bipolar East-West U.S.-Soviet experience. But China, from early on, had to worry about at least the two superpowers, both of whom were hostile, and eventually also added India, and these days probably has to worry about the possibility of other countries also gaining nuclear capabilities. And each of these issues affects China's views of deterrence. Now, let us first consider how the Chinese define deterrence, because that's an important aspect in comparing it with how we do. The Chinese term that is most often equated with deterrence is wei si. And indeed, the PLA translates this term as deterrence. The PLA's encyclopedia, for example, defines the term wei si zanlue as strategy of deterrence. But translations are often imprecise, and in this case, there is a key divergence here. For Western analysts, deterrence is seen as dissuading an opponent from acting in a particular way or following a particular course of action. We deterred the Soviets from taking West Berlin. Thomas Schelling, in his 1966 book, Arms and Influence, defines deterrence as, quote, the threat intended to keep an adversary from doing something. John Mearsheimer, in his book on conventional deterrence, similarly notes, deterrence in its broadest sense means persuading an opponent not to initiate a specific action. Glenn Snyder makes the same point, noting deterrence is the power to dissuade as opposed to the power to coerce or compel. So Western analysts clearly and specifically say that deterrence does not incorporate compellence. This is very different from the Chinese conception. The term wei si embodies both deterrence and compellence. The PLA Encyclopedia, for example, defines that strategy of deterrence as the display of military power or the threat of use of military power to compel an opponent to submit. In the volume of The Science of Military Strategy, which the Chinese have conveniently translated into English, Unfortunately, it's not available on Amazon, I don't think, but maybe available at better booksellers near you. Deterrence is described as playing two basic roles. One is to dissuade, and the other is to persuade. Both demand the opponent to submit to the deterrer's volition. In essence, science of strategy combines Schelling's definitions of deterrence and compellence within the Chinese term weise, and this is actually quite common in the Chinese literature. So in translations, you will often see something like, and therefore one will seek to deter an opponent into doing X. You look at this, you think, wow, that's a terrible translation. It is, but only because we associate the term deterrence only with dissuasion. In short, as one Chinese volume notes instead, the purpose of deterrence is to halt or prevent the other side from starting a conflict and thus protect one's own interests from aggression, or to shake the other side's will to resist and seize those interests or benefits that originally would have required conflict in order to obtain them. And if that sounds vaguely familiar to those of you who have read The Art of War, that's probably no accident, because it does, in fact, deterrence goes as well to the idea of the acme of achievement. The greatest general is the one who wins without fighting. Now, again, this constitutes a fundamental divergence of views regarding the role of deterrence about dissuasion versus coercion. And this then extends to our respective views on the role of deterrence in our national strategies. For the United States, according to the recent U.S. National Security Strategy and the National Military Strategy, we talk about a commitment to maintain superior capabilities to deter and defeat adaptive enemies. So we value deterrence as a goal. The very act of deterring an opponent or multiple opponents from acting in particular ways, whether in space or otherwise, is seen as serving American interests. And with regards to space, we are primarily focused on preventing our adversaries from acting against us in space. As Ambassador Greg Schulte has framed it, deterring in space. Now, I would suggest that the Chinese view deterrence much more as one means, among many, to other ends. Nuclear deterrence, space deterrence, conventional deterrence are all aspects of that one means. One would therefore employ weise, translated as deterrence, but encompassing both compellence as well as dissuasion, against an opponent into following a course of action that accords with larger Chinese strategic objectives. Now, from the Chinese perspective, strategic deterrence involves all of the components of comprehensive national power, including not only military force, but economic power, diplomatic influence, science and technology, even political and cultural unity. The Chinese talk about, for example, cultural security. These serve in turn to compel or deter opponents, but they need to be integrated. Now, for today, our focus, no surprise, is going to be primarily on military aspects of deterrence. And an essential component here is the need for actual military power, not just potential. In today's environment, that means fielding a military that can fight local wars under informationized conditions. Joint forces capable of exploiting modern information technology to wage non-contact, non-linear, non-symmetric warfare on land, sea, and air, in outer space, and in cyberspace. Successful deterrence also requires not just capabilities, but the will to use that power and the ability to communicate both capability and will to an opponent. So in a sense, weise is as much about psychology and communication as it is about capability. Now, in thinking about military capabilities for deterrent purposes, PLA analyses include conventional forces, nuclear forces, but also increasingly space and information capabilities. Each of these, frankly, is probably worthy of a very long discussion in and of itself. I certainly don't want to take time away from my counterparts here, so we'll go through this just very quickly. One element of deterrence that has been gaining attention is the concept of information deterrence. Information deterrence and information warfare goes far beyond just computer network attack, computer network exploitation. It involves the ability to influence the flow of information and the ability to influence the content of that flow. So, This has operational and tactical aspects, but also strategic ones, because Chinese information warfare writ large, perception management, context management, is aimed at decision makers and the public, civilian leaders and military leaders. It includes affecting the flow of information, but also the ability to provide for oneself access to information. Nuclear deterrence, Chinese characterize as coming in 3 degrees. Maximum nuclear deterrence, which involves the possibility of disarming an opponent. Minimum nuclear deterrence, a handful of nuclear weapons aimed at cities. And moderate intensity nuclear deterrence, involving a sufficient and effective nuclear capability. For many years, the Chinese were predominantly in the minimum nuclear deterrence realm. But as we are watching them slowly modernize their nuclear capabilities, there is a growing sense that perhaps China is interested in moderate intensity nuclear deterrence. The problem with nuclear weapons, as the Chinese have identified, is the same one that many in the West have identified: the issue of credibility. Nuclear weapons are so destructive that the ability to actually use them, the will to use them, is often going to be called into question. So, in this regard, conventional deterrence is seen, on the one hand, as more controllable and therefore more credible, more usable. And as modern technology has advanced, it has become more destructive without quite the larger ramifications, radiation and the like, of nuclear weapons. Space systems, interestingly, tie together conventional and nuclear deterrence. It also serves as a deterrent in its own right. For conventional deterrence, nuclear weapons make it possible to fight non-contact, non-linear, non-symmetrical wars because of the amount of information that is necessary to wage such a conflict. You need information to do targeting. You need information to coordinate your forces, to communicate with each other, to do battle damage assessment, to have the weather information in order to lay the foundations. Much of this is derived from space. For nuclear deterrence, on the other hand, PLA authors suggest that space systems may neutralize an opponent's nuclear deterrent, missile defense, so that when paired with one's own nuclear forces, an opponent will be deterred or can be coerced due to the unpalatable choices they are presented with. They are also an essential part of the information necessary to provide, again, nuclear targeting. Space is linked specifically to missile defense because it is in space that one would implement layered intercepts of enemy strategic offensive weapons, especially mid- and long-range missiles. In addition, however, PLA writing suggests that space systems may deter an opponent on their own. Here again, space systems refers not only to missile defense, but to anti-satellite capabilities. A space force effects deterrence in a number of ways. In the first place, the combination of expense, fragility, and vulnerability of space assets means that by threatening them, you are imposing upon an opponent fundamental cost-benefit analyses. Is, for example, a small island, say 100 miles off the shore of a very large Asian country, worth the likely cost of repairing or replacing a badly damaged or even destroyed space infrastructure? Moreover, because space systems are inherently dual use, they affect not only military but economic, political, and diplomatic spheres. So when you damage space systems, you automatically have implications elsewhere. If you damage an opponent's space infrastructure, you're imposing economic and diplomatic costs. Is defense of that island, if it would run the risk of destroying space systems, worth the consequent risks to the American ability to operate, say, in the Middle East, or to do financial transactions across the Atlantic, or to provide GPS positioning globally? The combination of first and second order effects, as the Chinese note, may be sufficient to persuade an opponent that they cannot attain victory at acceptable cost. So in order to effect deterrence, as I said earlier, the Chinese cite the need for actual capability, will to use that capability, and communication of both capability and will. And in this context, I would suggest the recent missile defense test reinforces the message from the 2010 missile defense and 2007 anti-satellite test about China's actual capabilities. Intriguingly, the 2007 ASAT test arguably also is a display of will. It generated an enormous amount of debris. Now, some folks have argued that the Chinese had no idea that it would generate all this debris. And they point to the 2010 and the most recent test about how, well, clearly the Chinese, have learned their lesson. I would suggest that writings that predate the 2007 ASAT test, in fact, suggest that that test may have been conducted in order to send the message of, look what could happen if a conflict spread into space. That it would, in fact, carry collateral damage, and therefore is something that should be avoided. And if China felt something was important enough to risk that other countries might approach China's opponents in order to dissuade them from active participation in a conflict situation. Let me conclude by just noting, missile defense on the issue of will has a major advantage over offensive systems. It is always possible that a country might choose not to engage in anti-satellite activities, particularly hard kill, because of the issue of damage. In fact, let me note here, the Chinese also emphasize that the implementation of hard kill attacks in space is something to be undertaken very carefully because of diplomatic and third-party consequences. But missile defense systems carry far less of a burden in this regard because as a defensive system, I don't think too many people would question the will of a possessor to employ such capabilities, especially in the event of an attack on the homeland. On that note, let me turn the mic over to...
Thank you, Gene.